Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another London lecture in this year's series, Remembering and Forgetting, brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. It's a great pleasure to have with us this evening my old friend Kieron O'Hara. He's a very versatile intellect. His expertise spans philosophy, computer science, and politics. His current academic post is in the Department of Electronics and Computer Science at the University of Southampton, where he works on trust, privacy, digital modernity, and other aspects of the politics, philosophy, and epistemology of technology. At the same time, he's a research fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, and you'll see what I mean by the versatile intellect bit. His books include Plato and the Internet, The Enlightenment, A Beginner's Guide, After Blair, Conservatism Beyond Thatcher, which was reviewed by David Cameron, no less, and he was elected 6 months later. Whether there's a causal link there or not, we will never know. And watch out for his new book, which is due out later this year, Blockchain Democracy. Kieron will speak this evening about Insta-Worthy memories and filtered truth. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Edward. Thanks for the invitation. Nice to be here, particularly on the 99th series of London lectures of DRIP. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Insta-Worthy memories, filtered truth, technology and the way it interacts with our memory. That's the idea. And I'm going to give a kind of very, very whistle-stop tour of the history of technology and memory and the way they work together in order to think about the technology we have today and the way that particularly interacts with our memories and with our psyche generally. So I'll start off with a bit personal history. I'm going to talk about my second datable memory, which occurred, I can date it to the minute, on the 18th of March 1967, just before 6:15. I was about 3, and I've got the slide now. Can't be shown on the YouTube video, but I can show it in the hall. So you're all privileged to see what my first datable memory is, and it's this. It's a scene from Doctor Who, and it's the cliffhanger to a particular episode of Doctor Who. And I remembered this, and I loved it. It terrified me, and I played games around this particular memory. And of course, all the context disappeared over the years. I completely forgot the context. It was only much later when I learned what the context of this particular scene was that I was able to date it. Until then, it was just a memory. And I'll tell you what's going on. So the Doctor is the man in the exact centre of the screen with his back to the camera, and he's arrived on a planet that's been colonised by Earth people, and it's run as a kind of odd mix of George Orwell 1984 Big Brother style command and control, plus Butlins Pontins holiday camp stuff, right? So it's clearly a bit of satire in the script, and unbeknownst to anybody, a race of evil giant crabs has taken over the machinery of government. That could happen, you know. And the Doctor is poking around and gets very suspicious. And at the end of episode 2, he demands to speak to the Big Brother character. And so the Big Brother character is always seen in these giant telescreens on the wall in all the public places. And so he gets this interview with the Big Brother, and the Big Brother man is for some reason very diffident, he's very disoriented, and he's obviously under some kind of pressure, and then suddenly, from the side of the screen, this giant crab claw comes out, grabs him by the neck, terrified the life out of me. I loved it. I probably didn't sleep for weeks, and that became the subject of my game. But all I remembered going forward was the scene, right? I didn't remember any of that plot. And it was long thought that this was the only that all the records of this particular show had been wiped, because the BBC, in its wisdom, would get rid of all its black and white TV shows because it didn't think it could sell them in the future. So for a long time, it was just my memory, and I didn't mind. I was a kid; it wasn't a problem. It turns out there were records made because Doctor Who is beloved by nerds who love tech stuff and do stuff. So one man used to watch Doctor Who with a camera in front of the TV screen and would take a photograph every 30 seconds. Right? This is one of his shots. So there was that record, but there was also an audio record because there was a little technical whiz kid. I don't think he was very old. Who had rigged up his old TV set, 405-line VHF TV set, round to a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and actually got pretty good audio soundtracks of all the Doctor Who's on reel-to-reel tape. And then the BBC found these eventually, and they released them on first cassettes and then CDs with little narratives from actors just to fill in the gaps. And I bought some of these, being a nerdy type, and I listened to a show called The Macra Terror, and I listened to episode 1, and there was no recollection. Listened to episode 2, no recollection, until the cliffhanger, which was this scene, and I suddenly went, oh my God, that is the scene I've remembered for 20, 30, 40 years, whatever the hell it was. Oh my God. And I was so happy. I ran and told my wife. She wasn't interested. I told all my friends. They didn't care. But to me, it really mattered, right? Because I had this Proustian moment of memory. You know, it's like the Madeleine in the coffee. Fantastic. Only thing was, my memory had actually misrepresented a few things. So you can't quite see on this scene. I'm now showing my second BBC slide, which is copyright. But this... that's a scene from earlier in the episode. So you can see that it's a really big screen on the wall in a public place. And this is how all the screens were, right? And this is obviously taken from George Orwell's 1984. I was 3, I'd not read Orwell at that point. Possibly read Animal Farm, I don't know. But certainly hadn't read 1984. And so this was straight over my head. No idea. So for me, the screen became the sort of screen I was familiar with, which was this kind of screen, a television screen, television set in the corner of a suburban living room, which is what our living room kind of looked like. That's a stock photograph. We didn't have as many children as that, but that's more or less what our living room looked like. So we had this. So this giant telescreen became a little television set. And the talking head on the screen was, in the programme, was a political figure. But I wasn't used to, again, I didn't get the satire of the politics of it. For me, the only talking heads I ever saw on the TV was this kind of guy, the news reader, in front of the expensive backgrounds such as this. So this Big Brother character became a newsreader. What happened to the giant crabs? Well, I used to have this toy spider. It looked just like that. It was fantastic. It was made of rubber. It was about that big. It had elastic like that. You used to bounce. It was brilliant. I love that spider. So the crabs became spiders. So in my memory of this sort of amazingly political thing going on in outer space actually became something like England is invaded by giant spiders. And the newsreader is about to tell us all about that. And then suddenly he's hoiked off the screen by a giant spider, which actually, of course, gives the game away. But of course, I wasn't thinking logically, being only 3. So that was my memory. And there's 2 interesting things about that. The first is that my memory completely misrepresented every single important detail of the plot. Right? I was totally wrong, 0 out of 10 in the exam. Right? But secondly, even though my memory was a total misrepresentation, I recognised it. I still had that connection of recognition that suddenly I knew that was what we were. That was what I had seen, and that's, I think, really interesting. It raises a number of philosophical questions. I'm just going to listen there in this slide. I'm not going to talk about them. I'm not even going to discuss them again. They're very difficult philosophical questions. I'll leave these things to Edward Harcourt to solve. But what was my memory of? What was I? Why was it a memory of the TV program and not a memory of the spider? Right? And I remember my memory now, but what is it still a memory, even though I know that it was totally wrong? It's a fascinating set of issues. I'm not going to talk about these. I'm going to talk about the technology that interacts with memory and helps with these kind of moments. I'm just going to whiz through the next slide and think about. So there's lots of types of memory. There's specific episodic memory of the past. That's like me remembering Doctor Who. There's sort of general episodic memory. So, you know, I remember the butcher on the corner, but I don't remember anything specific about him. I can place him, I can see him in an image, but my mental image is kind of a composite or an archetype or something like that. But we also have semantic memory. We remember meanings of words, and we can use words properly. We have factual memory, prospective memory. You know, I remembered that I had to come here tonight, so I remembered something about the future, and so on and so forth. There's tons of types of memory. They're all connected to the past in some way, and I think they're all sort of constructed on the fly. This is an assumption of mine. I'm not going to argue for this, but they're all memories are constructed on the fly through all sorts of things. This is, I think, specifically true of episodic memory, which we're going to be talking about. But there's physiological states and changes. The brain, clearly very important for our memory. People with brain damage often have great difficulty with memory. So the brain and other bits of the body, clearly very important for memory. But we also have input from our imagination, from the narratives we make up, the narratives we hear, from the linguistic concepts we use, from all the social practices, including play and conversation, and records and archives. And basically, when we construct our memories, we use all the resources we have to hand, including technology. And this sort of view of memory, which I'm going to elaborate on in the course of this talk, is it's kind of it follows from a broader theory about the mind, which is called extended cognition, which again I'm going to assume rather than argue for. But the idea of extended cognition is that we're embodied creatures and we're social creatures, and that's key to what we are. And so when we think about our cognition or our psychology or our minds, whatever goes on in there, it's not just what's happening in the brain, it makes essential reference to all sorts of things. The socio-cultural environment, as Edmund Burke argued, or Maurice Halbwachs, who was a sociologist who was a leading theorist of memory, but also the body. I've got Maine de Biron, but also Rod Brooks, who was at MIT. I don't know if he's still there, but he used to make little artificially intelligent insects that ran around the environment, and they didn't have any memory as such, but they used the environment as a sort of an external memory for themselves. Fascinating stuff. The constructed environment helps with our cognition. Andy Clark at Edinburgh has discussed this in a number of excellent books. But if you think about it, the amount of cognitive effort we put into negotiating a difficult environment with, let's say, an uneven floor. If you're walking through a forest, it's quite difficult to walk. You have to look where you're putting your feet. But what we do with the constructed environment, we just make that a really simple problem. We make the floor flat. And then we can just walk around. There's actually a huge thing here. I might fall over at some point. But apart from that, the floor is flat. And now the virtual environment, the web, the internet, as a number of philosophers have talked about, including Paul Smart, my former colleague at Southampton. Also, all these things go into episodic memory, which is going to make essential reference to traces, records, narrations, reminiscence, rehearsal, all those sort of things. And so my game as a boy helped me keep that memory alive. And then when I was confronted with the actual record, suddenly I got the moment of recognition. So from that, so there's my assumption. I assume that we are extended minds, that our minds reach out into the world and we can't understand our minds without understanding the world. It follows from that as the socio-technical context changes, so does the way we manage memory. And that's going to be the theme of my talk. I'm going to be talking about the technology that's important for memory now, but to do that in I'm going to place that in context by talking by giving a very schematic history of how memory and technology and archives and records have interacted. So I'm going to start off in what's called the pre-modern world. So historians and sociologists talk about the pre-modern world as sort of the world in the West up to about 1500. So I mean, think ancient, think medieval, right? And they're characterized by very small-scale, tight-knit societies. There's little social mobility. You're born into a particular status and you stay there, and that you have a place in the great chain of being, and that's where you stay. You trust based on personal acquaintance, eye to eye. I trust the people I know. I don't trust the people I don't know. And my actions are informed by traditions and norms. Why did you do that? It's what I've always done, right? So that's sort of the pre-modern world. And in that world, memory becomes based on lots of mnemonics, lots of tradition, lots of practices, and basically it's a lot of social and public practices. So memory has this very big social and public aspect. And there's a nice example, the book of Deuteronomy. This is an example I've taken from Jan Assmann, who's an Egyptologist who died last year, a great Egyptologist. And he looked at the book of Deuteronomy. That's the book of the Bible that gets a bad press because it's politically very incorrect. But the book is basically 3 sermons by Moses to the Israelites on, I think, the plain of Moab or something, just before they're about to enter the promised land. And the second one is all about the covenant that the Israelites have with the Lord. And Moses' theme is, look, the Lord is not going to forget this covenant, so you had better remember it too. And a lot of that second section of the book of Deuteronomy is all about mnemonics for how they should remember their relationship to the Lord and how they shouldn't forget through practice, through talk. And some of the mnemonics as kind of listed here, there's the obvious ones like learning bits of text or sacred text by heart, but talking to future generations. They're told to talk to their children, talk to their friends and their family. Lots of sort of markings, public inscriptions, put it in your poetry, put it in your songs. Commemorative festivals like Passover are all designed to focus the minds of the Israelites on what they should be remembering, which was their covenant with the Lord. So that tells you that memory in the pre-modern world is very arbitrary, it's very unplanned, it's very partial, in both senses of the word. It's partial, only covers certain things, and it's partial in that it's very biased. And if you want to plan public memory or collective memory, it's very dependent on cooperation and obedience. I'm going to skip the next 2 slides. When we move on to the modern world, so this is about 1500 onwards, as the historians and sociologists would say, the modern world is much more individualistic, and our individualism is expressed through choice and through rationality. So we get institutions like democracy, free markets, freedom of association, all these kind of build up. Trust, we obviously keep trust by personal acquaintance, but we add to it trust in systems. So it's not only that I trust the farmer to give me food that's edible, I trust the consumer protection system to make sure that all farmers are going to be trustworthy. And these kinds of abstract systems enable the construction of anonymous societies that are larger and more productive, right? And so we end up far richer and ultimately in Senate House, London. So modern mnemonics change. So they're no longer these sort of acted out public things. We get technology for public administration. So the archive and the record appears. And these are designed. And they're designed, they select pieces of information, and they're designed to my notes. They're designed to carry certain things, the information that's needed, and to get access to them, there are rules. You have to present yourself. You have to pass exams to get access. But we also get gradual democratization for the individual. So the individual gets his or her archives start to appear. We get diaries, we get photography, we get tape recording, film, and so on. Ultimately, we get kind of people have their own web pages and so on. So in the modern period, memory or the archive is planned, but it's incomplete. So for public information gathering or corporate information gathering, it depends on what the administrators need to hold. They will gather what they need, they will keep what they need, and they will not bother with the rest. So like the BBC, with the episode of Doctor Who, didn't think you could make any money out of selling old black and white programs, so they just wiped that. Right. So it's not complete, but it's planned. Private information gathering is kind of chaotic. It depends what you bother to keep. You know, you might keep all your photographs in a shoebox in the attic or something like that. So the result of that is that technology to mediate memory starts to confront us with something that we kind of agree to call the truth or the record or the true record. And we sort of say truth is normative for memory, by which I mean if memory contradicts the record, it's wrong. So my memory contradicts the actual record of the television program I remembered, so my memory was wrong. That's what makes my memory wrong. And even during the modern period, there was pushback from philosophers, intellectuals. This man, who looks alarmingly like Dominic Cummings, is actually Baudelaire. And I'm not going to read out the quote, but basically he's just horrified by photography, and he thinks that everyone should be looking at great works of art, and he's horrified that people are actually looking at photographs of themselves that are taken, that they've taken. Right. Our squalid society rushed Narcissus to a man to gaze at its trivial image on a scrap of metal. That's probably why he's looking like that. The camera pointed at him, got very cross. Friedrich Nietzsche, a different worry. The worry here is that if we keep records of the past, it may stop us thinking afresh, it may stop us thinking new things, we may get very conservative, we may not move forward. And he has, I mean, Nietzsche is enormously quotable. He has this splendid quote: "The past has to be forgotten if it is not to become the gravedigger of the present." It's a very unsentimental view of history. And also alienation. There's a splendid play by Samuel Beckett called Krapp's Last Tape. It's about a character with the splendid name of Krapp, who is obsessively records all his thought onto reel-to-reel tape, and obsessively listens to all his reel-to-reel tapes from the past. So much of the play is him at the age of 80 listening to a recording of him that he made when he was 50, just after listening to a recording of himself made when he was 20. Anyway, this is Samuel Beckett. It does not go well. And this is a line for they've just been listening to that stupid bastard I took myself for 30 years ago. Hard to believe I was ever as bad as that. Thank God that's all done with anyway. That's right. So he did not become at peace with himself. But now I think the modern era, I would say, is over, and now we have digital modernity, as Edward very kindly mentioned. And basically, what's happening is a new narrative of where we are is emerging, and it's emerging in books like this. And this isn't my particular view, this is just my synthesis of what a lot of people are writing at the moment. So I've read all these books, so you do not have to. You can thank me later. But they all have titles like The Second Machine Age, The Singularity is Near, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, The Economic Singularity, Our Final Invention, Superintelligence. They're all about, there's been a sudden, and this has been turbocharged with generative AI in the last few years. But this goes back some time. And so what I want to say about digital modernity, which is the narrative that holds for us today, is that if we think about analog modernity, which I've just been talking about, has a number of periods. So high modernity is like the 20th century, and that's sort of industrialization, bureaucracy, that kind of thing, the sort of thing that Max Weber would write about, or the Frankfurt School, or talk at Parsons. And then more recently, the last sort of 20 years of the century, people started talking about reflexive modernity, and we had Anthony Giddens talked about reflexive modernity, Ulrich Beck, who else? Zygmunt Bauman talked about liquid modernity, Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history. All that kind of stuff kind of emerged, and then came the growth of the internet and the appearance of the World Wide Web. And my claim is that that's when these narratives or myths or whatever you want to call them flip, and we get digital modernity. So what is digital modernity? Well, this is characteristics of digital. I don't know if this is readable from the back. I hope it is. But basically, what we now have is very, very dense networks of individuals. A very important work written about 2000 by Manuel Castells called The Network Society. And that was very prescient, I think. And basically, these networks are created by devices that connect us all. And to do that, we get datafication. Everything gets turned into data. So that's the data is being transferred through devices that connect us all. And so much data is created that every single man, woman, child on the planet, on average, produces 1.5 megabytes per day of data. And we will produce far more than that, because we will all produce much more than the average. But it's about 1.5 megabytes a day. What's 1.5 megabytes? If Charles Dickens sat down with Microsoft Word and wrote Little Dorrit, that would be about 1.5 megabytes. So every person on the planet, every day on average, produces a little Dorrit's worth of stuff. Much Dorrit, in fact, giant loads of Dorrit, in fact. And all this Dorrit, all this data goes into what I've called the ambient data infrastructure, which I will talk about later, but as you can imagine, it's a data infrastructure that's all around us. And that it's very, very important for digital modernity. It's built on surveillance, it's searchable, and it will host inference, particularly machine learning, artificial intelligence. What's the inference like? Well, it embodies what's been called computational rationality. That's a phrase I borrowed from Gershman et al., who wrote a very good paper in Science magazine about 10 years or so ago. But it's basically probabilistic inference at huge scale, managing trade-offs in effort and precision and timeliness. So it comes up with the best it can at the right time, just when it's needed for some action, and to maximize the expected utility of output. So it's very, very probabilistic. It's very utilitarian, the calculations going on with the data. And that's led to what I call a subjunctive world, by which I mean, whereas in the modern era, in the 20th century, we used to choose to demonstrate our individuality. Now it's much more that the world is personalized around us. We're nudged, right? We're influenced. We receive recommendations. Surveillance capitalism has emerged. A splendid book by Shoshana Zuboff. It's well worth reading. It's that thick, but it's well worth reading. And in that, she describes all the ways in which our demand, producers don't wait for demand to emerge and then supply it. They anticipate the demand in advance because they have the data. And so we have this sort of slogan, which I've got in bold: we seek what we would want if only we knew enough about ourselves. The we would want, that's what makes it the subjunctive mode. Okay. So, for example, if I want to read a book, I don't choose one anymore. I go to Amazon. Amazon recommends something that actually I would have chosen if only I knew as much about myself as Amazon does. Right? That's what's going on. And from there you get a kind of digital Gnosticism, or what I call digital Gnosticism, which is again another slogan. The best that reality can achieve is to tend towards the perfection of the algorithm and the data. Right? It's the algorithm and the data that are perfect, and we're the imperfect reflections of that. I'll give you an example just to sort of see how it works. The smartphone is a brilliant invention for all sorts of ways. One of the things it does that no other machine has done in the whole of human history is it can count the number of steps you make in a day. No other machine has ever been able to do this. And then someone got some medical data and crunched some numbers and came up with 10,000 steps as a sort of a reasonable number of steps that you could take in order to remain healthy and wealthy. And then an app appeared that would tell you how many steps you'd done that day, or the average of the last week, or the average of the last month, or you could compare how many steps you'd done with those done by your sister, or you could compare those with someone random from Wyoming or something could be compared with. And then you suddenly you want to do 10,000 steps in a day. And so you say, right, well, we'll get off at the Angel and we'll walk the last half mile, because then I'll have done my 10,000 steps. So what's happening is reality, like you, are conforming to the demands of the data and not the other way around. So that's what I mean by digital Gnosticism and the importance of the algorithm and the data over physical reality. So in the subjunctive world, the record is very important because all these recommendations and actions choices are rooted in data from the past, not only about ourselves, but others similar to us. Right? And it would work if the system knew nothing about you at all. If it just knew about people similar to you, it would work very well. So this is the complete opposite of Nietzsche's demand to bury the past. The past is extremely important. So given all that, I'm now thinking, okay, back to personal memory. What records and archives in digital modernity are important for memory? And all the old ones remain. We still have archives. We still have shoeboxes full of photographs in the attic. But these are the three big inventions: the ambient data infrastructure, blockchain, content sharing. Well, the ambient data infrastructure is behind all of these things. I'm not going to read them out, you don't. But if you bought your ticket on Eventbrite, if you came here using Google Maps or the London Transport app or Uber, if you Googled me, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you've looked for a decent restaurant in the district, you will appear on the ambient data infrastructure. But that's no good for our memories, really, because we only get indirect access to it via the services we're offered. We're entitled to our personal data, but nobody seeks it out. I mean, in general, data protection regulation gives us a right to see our personal data, but nobody does. So the ambient data infrastructure is actually a public corporate resource. So that's no good for memory. What about blockchain? Well, blockchain is the architecture, distributed ledger architecture that underpins Bitcoin. I'm not going to talk about Bitcoin here, but it's brilliant. It's absolutely, with my computer science hat on, it's a genius piece of work, and it's very, very secure. It can be changed, but it can't be changed easily, and it can't be changed secretly. So it's often proposed as a means for people who care about these things to store their personal data. But again, actually nobody cares about these things, so there's no evidence of any demand for this. So blockchain goes. We're left with content sharing, and the records we use are shared and social. And we're actually going back to that pre-modern world where memory is becoming social and public. And it's based around all the social media stuff that we do: profiles, photos, videos, tweets, subreddits, pins, CVs if you're on LinkedIn. I mean, we can also get validated through likes, so you can find out what works and what doesn't work, what photographs do people like, what photographs do people not like, and then you can improve things. You can improve yourself. You can take better photographs. If you're a restaurant, you can create more Insta-Worthy interiors. If you sing on TikTok, you can use autotune. You can use Instagram filters. We improve ourselves. And in the midst of all that improvement and selection, we also have these sort of ridiculous gremlins like deepfakes and AI hallucinations. So there's this strange world of idealized stuff and lies and mistakes, all of which is what we're sort of consulting when we look at our phones to remind us of things. This is a quote from a Taiwanese influencer. You construct a much better version of yourself on social media. You post selfies taken at the right angle, with perfect makeup, with filters. You want to become the version of yourself that exists in the apps. And this appeared in The Economist a couple of weeks ago, illustrating an article about the growth of plastic surgery across the globe. There's a huge boom in plastic surgery driven by Instagram. because people want to look like they are in the apps. And this is global. This is not a ritual thing. This is the global south. Apparently, I am reliably informed everyone in Iran has had a nose job. It is crazy. Lebanon is a real centre for, Lebanon's economy has collapsed. It's still a centre for plastic surgery. And this is another example of how the world is changing through plastic surgery to look like the record as created in social media. Right? So again, the world changes in response to the data. So pause for breath, just going through what where we are. So episodic memory is a dance between our retrieval of stuff from the brain, from archives, and our imagination. And we create images, they're informed by recall, they may be supported by evidence, and that evidence may come from tech, it may come from media, or it may just come from testimony, talking to people. It may just be what people have always said. But we have these moments of confirmation. Sometimes the Proustian moment, like when I recognised the television programme, famous novel by Proust. He tastes a cake that he's dipped in his tea, and suddenly he remembers some deep aspect of his childhood. But there's also confrontation with the social record. And these records are getting ever richer. They're socially based, they're not individually based, they're not created by individuals for individuals, they're created by individuals for their social networks. They're filtered for perfection. And some of it's really important. I'm not even in this talk mentioning the dark side, but it's amazing how many crimes and war crimes are acted out on social media. But we also get a lot of trivia. We get all the narcissism that would have worried Baudelaire. We get a lot of showing off. It's fun. I mean, I'm not criticising any of this. It's fun. It's all about socialisation, but what it is not is reliable. So memory comes in lots of sort of grain sizes. There's the memories of individuals, memories of small groups, and then there's the wider collective societal memory. And it's quite clear that in this sort of social media driven world, it's the small group records that are really important. And the small group dynamic is very powerful. That's when we talk of peer pressure, it's the small group that applies the peer pressure. And so we end up with impossible ideals, fear of missing out. Everybody thinks everyone else is having more fun than I am, even though everybody thinks I'm having more fun than they are. Extremism. I wrote a book that Edward didn't mention for some reason, I don't know, on extremism about 10 years ago, which, and again, it fosters in small groups. Violence fosters in small groups. That's where extremism comes from. Because that small group dynamic, not listening to others, you become an echo chamber, and suddenly what seems extreme to everyone else seems reasonable to you. So the question is, so I'm not saying that social media are a bad thing. What I'm saying is these are risks about using the record of social media to drive our memory and drive our psyches. So can we navigate these? And the bad combination, this is the bad combination. First of all, we have shared content that isn't reliable. And it's not reliable because it's not its function. It's not there to be reliable. Government records are there to be reliable. They're not. I worked in that space for a while. They're not reliable. They're meant to be reliable. Your news feeds your feeds from your friends on social media are not at all meant to be reliable. But combine that idealized, shared, unreliable content with the idea that respect for the data and the algorithm exceeds our respect to the physical, this kind of digital Gnosticism. And so data analysis just becomes feedback to which physical reality is expected to react, to adapt. Right? Then you might have problems. So I'm coming to a halt. I'm not going to come to any conclusions. I'm just going to wave my hands and sort of say, gosh, isn't it terrible? Isn't it difficult? Isn't it hard? But I'm going to end with a couple of parables. And there's a famous episode in Plato's Republic, which is called Plato's Cave. I imagine many of you will be aware of it, but for the benefit of everybody, in Plato's cave, there are prisoners, and they are shackled to the floor, and they're facing forward. And the only light they get is behind them. It's a fire, and that is throwing flickering shadows onto the wall. And that's all the knowledge they're getting, is these flickering shadows. And Plato's point is that that's what we're like on Earth. We have this very unreliable information. And in the parable, Plato compares these prisoners with a prisoner who's escaped, and the prisoner's outside. He sees the grass, the trees, and he sees as we do. And in Plato's interpretation of this, that prisoner is someone who understands the Platonic ideals, the great ideas in abstract conceptual ideas of mathematics and logic and so on. And he has a sort of a far better view of the world than these constrained people in Plato's cave. So that's Plato's cave. So I sort of thought, well, what if Zuckerberg had a cave? So exactly the same setup. Prisoners chained to the floor of the cave, facing forward. There's a fire behind them. It's flickering, the shadow's flickering. The difference is this. Zuckerberg's prisoners have artificial intelligence, they've got machine learning, they've got computational rationality, and all those techniques are able to analyze the shadows on the wall, find the very, very weak signals in the very, very noisy data, and actually give the prisoners a readout of what's happening. So in other words, the shadows, combined with the technology, become informative. And indeed, if you were then confronted with the escaped prisoner who then goes on about the world outside, they might seem far more real and far more interesting and far more important than the outside world that the prisoner had encountered, and come back with no doubt fevered, possibly exaggerated stories about it. So in Zuckerberg's cave, the prisoners don't need to escape, because escaping into the real world teaches them nothing. They know exactly what they knew before. Now, in the Plato's cave parable in the Republic, the prisoners don't know that they don't know. And this is true of lots of sort of similar cases. So in Descartes' Cogito ergo sum, his thought experiment about what would happen if a malevolent demon was sort of making me think that I was in a room lecturing to 80 people, but in fact, I'm somewhere else at home in bed or something like that. These things have happened to me before, I have to say. But it's essential as part of the thought experiment that I don't know that I'm being fooled by the demon. Similarly, you know, if you're in Hilary Putnam's thought experiment, if you were a brain in a vat being fed signals that made it look as if you were living a world in the outside world, you'd have to not know that was happening to you. But in Zuckerberg's case, you might be totally aware of your situation, right? But you could be quite confident about the information you're getting from the AI and the machine learning. So they might prefer the discipline of the virtual, so they don't need to escape. And I'm ashamed to say I haven't seen the film The Matrix, which actually came out right at the start of digital modernity. However, it's a bit like taking the blue pill in The Matrix, right? Which is, if you take the red pill, you get to see what's going on and you see the reality. This is why the sort of far-right populists all talk about red pilling. But if they take the blue pill, they just get the virtual reality that they're dealt, and that's all nice and sweet. And in a sense, the narrative of digital modernity at least says we're all to a degree in Zuckerberg's cave. And what we don't know is how beneficial or harmful this may be. And that's I'm gonna leave it at that slightly unknown thing. The big issue, it seems to me, is mental health. The evidence is very equivocal. There are certainly people who are seriously harmed by social media addiction. That much we know. There are other people for whom it's a godsend. There are isolated people who social media are fine things. Most of us, I suspect, are kind of in the middle and are more or less cool with it. Don't use it too much. We use it to WhatsApp our friends in a group and so on. We have interesting things going on in the world. There's I won't talk about the Chinese, but the Australians have just passed a law banning children under 16 using social media, and that I have to say that will keep the attention of the world. Because, well, my first thought when I saw that announcement was, well, good luck with that. And the first issue is how on earth are they going to define that? How are they going to enforce it? So we're all going to be watching them to see how they do that. Assuming they succeed, what effect will it have on mental health of children and young adults in Australia? It's a really interesting question, and no one knows the answer. But that's the point about memory, and indeed all psychological functioning. Ultimately, memory has been associated with particular ideas of the truth throughout the modern era, and it's quite difficult to throw that off. The main thing about memory is it should work for us and help us. And this is my last substantive slide. And it's a quote from a novel by Sebastian Barry. It's called The Secret Scripture. And I think this actually phrases very well what I would like to say. It's first, it wasn't so much a question of whether she had written the truth about herself, or told the truth, or believed what she wrote and said was true, or even whether they were true things in themselves. The important thing seemed to me that the person who wrote and spoke was admirable, living and complete. And I think that's a very nice statement to end with. I have 3 more slides. I'm the only person who ends and then has 3 more slides. First, please don't sue me if I've accidentally used your image. Secondly, I'd like to dedicate this talk to a friend of mine, Yorick Wilkes, who died a year or 2 ago. He was a very brilliant man and very larger-than-life figure, and he worked a lot in this area, technology and memory. He was very interested in. Had some very interesting projects, and that's me and him 20 years ago. The camera does not lie. I did indeed used to look like that. I'm the one on the right. I hope it's clear. My final slide, shameless advertisement. I did write a book on digital. If you're interested in digital modernity, I have an open access book on my website. That link, free download. It's fine. It looks like self-published, but in fact it's just a crap cover. It's actually properly peer-reviewed and properly published by a proper company. And I'll leave that slide up there in case anyone's interested. But I'd like to say thank you very much indeed for listening. Thanks.
Hi, Kieron. Thanks for the lecture. I just had a quick question about the idea of the shared content not being reliable, and your thoughts on the ideas of shared content on a mass scale, and the way that we as individuals can collate that data being something that can then be reliable, and for example would be like the group Forensic Architecture and some of the investigations that they've done, say in the murder of the journalist. I'm forgetting her name right now because I'm nervous for whatever reason, but yeah. So if you had any thoughts on the way that actually we might be able to inverse this relationship and turn it into something that is reliable.
Yeah. Well, I think my point mainly is its function is not to be reliable. And so it's very hard to get reliability out of it. You're absolutely right. I mean, of course, if we examine this stuff critically, then yes, you absolutely can spot the things that are exaggerated. If you expect exaggeration, because a lot of social media content, you take 6 selfies of yourself, and you look like a sort of exhausted chimpanzee and 5 of them. You delete those and you keep the 6th. So you look better than morphogenic. So we sort of have to be aware of that sort of thing. And so social media literacy and all that stuff absolutely has a role to play. And I certainly didn't want, I don't want this to sound like, oh my God, it's terrible. This is just a kind of a warning that our relationship with the record is moving away from the modern world and going back to a sort of pre-modern thing. But you're quite right about the crime stuff. And indeed, sometimes you don't really want to know the details. Sometimes what you really want to know is just sort of what happened at quite an abstract level. And you mentioned crime. Crime is something that is highly social, and criminals will record and post what they do. War crimes, highly social. Virtually nobody would do a war crime on their own. War crimes are always group things, and they get posted on social media. And I've seen estimates, they're usually between 10 and 20%. The content moderation on social media sites that get rid of violent content actually quite often removes important evidence about war crimes. So in that case, it's not necessarily the reliability of the evidence so much as, oh my God, this went on, and clearly someone's dead in this picture, and it may alter certain aspects of it, but what you want to know is something else. So your point is absolutely well made. Indeed, we're not powerless here. Even though the tech giants are very important, we're not powerless.
At the beginning, when you were introduced, I think there was also a reference to your interest in politics. And obviously this is quite pertinent at this time with the recent elections in the US. And apparently I was reading just yesterday that the American National Archives are already being altered and certain items are being removed from the records of American history about, for example, Native American Indians. And apparently they were too present. And so that's being diminished already. So
sorry, I'm laughing. It's not
funny.
Yeah,
it's not funny, but
yes,
absolutely. But I guess the point, I don't know what the question is exactly, but it's just that relationship between our current politics, or the way politics seems to be going, and the kind of the fact that these things don't seem to be that protected, that someone can come in and virtually within 24 hours, the National Archives are being altered and people are resigning. But, in a sense, if they resign, it just becomes easier for those archives to be corrupted further. But anyway, it just seems a really dangerous period that we're living in a sense that the fact that all of this stuff can be simply altered, I don't know, so readily, just seems really frightening to me.
I think, well, you're absolutely right. It's a really good point. So I think partly it is a function of our switch from sort of the modern world, which had, it had a respect for the archive and the record and for government, and that just doesn't obtain anymore, right? And it's not just the States. I mean, the States. I won't say anything about the 45th and 47th presidents of the United States, but my book that's coming out in the summer will mention him, and he should be trembling. He should be trembling. If he could read. But it happens elsewhere. So Argentina, under the Peronist government, simply put out false statistics. The Chinese government was worried about youth unemployment. The first thing it did was stop publishing the stats, or came up with a new algorithm, recalculated, so the series was just incomparable, and suddenly it looked great. And I think it is a 21st century thing to happen. It's sort of hard to imagine that happening in the 20th century. It no doubt did. It no doubt did happen. I don't say for a minute that the 20th century was a paradise. But, if you think about the meticulous records kept by the Nazis, this is crazy. But, they kept those records, and these became extremely useful in prosecuting them after the war. and so on and so forth. So I think this mindset towards our immediate reaction to the content, not the quality of the content. The fact that, you know, scientific method or reason or rationality is sort of downgraded compared to likes or convenience and so on. That is, I think, a 21st century thing. It's not, you know, so Trump is guilty of it, but I don't think he started it, and I don't think he's probably not the worst offender. So I share your gloom at that thought.
But it's incredible that in our time and age that there are people now, you know, supposedly quite large numbers of people that believe the Earth is flat.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just incredible, is it not?
It is. I am reminded. I shouldn't tell jokes, but there is a splendid cartoon, Warner Brothers cartoon, about Christopher Columbus, and he's trying to persuade the King of Spain to let him go around the world. He tries to explain. He's saying, "Look, the world is round. The world is round like my head." The King of Portugal gets this giant shovel from behind the throne, hits him over the head, and says, "The world is flat like your head." That's a great moment. Irrelevant, but a great moment. So there was a key phrase that I mentioned in one of my others that happened almost on the cusp of the 20th, 21st century. It was actually about 2003. It was into George W. Bush's period of office, and someone in the Bush administration, fed up with being told, "Look, you can't invade Iraq. You won't succeed. Just said, you know, we are fed up of taking criticism from the truth-based community. We make our own truths." And that's the view. And I think it's been influenced quite a lot by surprisingly left-wing philosophical climate, particularly the move in sociology to criticise scientific rationality and to say that rationality, scientific method, reason, they're all exercises of power. That's quite a dangerous thing to say, because then, well, okay, if it's an exercise of power, why should I therefore not exercise it? And of course, ultimately, that grew into postmodernism. So my view of digital modernity and the views of reflexive modernity are partly aimed at saying postmodernism is wrong. Right? Modernity is continuing, it's evolving and changing, but it's continuing. But postmodernity says things like, you know, truth, identity, reason. These things are literally constructs that we can drop if we want to. And of course, the Trumps of this world say, "Okay, then I shall."
Hi, Kieron. You mentioned social media being a godsend. I think it's really worth repeating that, and interesting. Many people can relate. The digital identities we have, in many cases, are more authentic than the ones we present in real life. Let's say when we're in environments where we can't be authentic due to culture or family. I think it's a real resonating thing and a really cool thing about the era we're in. So that's just an acknowledgement. A question you'd be the person to ask, when our lifespans eventually end, let's say the next 50, 60, 100 years, what happens to all of this data, all of our social media accounts? Is this something you've touched on in your book or a future topic that you're researching?
It's not. I did look at this a while ago. Your point about identity, absolutely. I won't expand on that. You put it very eloquently yourself. The treatment of the dead is very interesting, because it won't be well. I think someone calculated it would be something like about 2050, when there'll be more dead people on Facebook than live, or something. It's that kind of time. So it's not, but there will be increasingly many of these people, and there will be fights over who owns the rights to the data. It will be very hard to get hold of the data in many cases. It may be that the data you have, or the data that your social media career has piled up, belongs to the social media company, but your family may want it, but may have no rights to it. And the flip side is, you certainly have no data protection rights. Only the living have data protection rights. So you suddenly fall out of GDPR at the moment you drop dead, which is probably the least of your problems, but it could be a problem nonetheless if you have things you want to cover up. So what happens to all this? There is a book out by a bloke called Carl Ehrman, I think, a student of Luciano Floridi's, who, I wasn't convinced by the book, but he did say, he made a very eloquent case that actually this is going to be a real problem going forward, and we need to think about what this is and who has rights to what, and because of course it's infinitely copyable. So you could have, everyone could have a share of it. On the other hand, the environmental cost of data centers is not small. So if we don't delete some of this crap, most of it is nonsense. I mean, who cares that you bought the Taylor Swift album 3 years ago?
You say nonsense. I'm just thinking of like our children and their children. They'll have like a link to their ancestor, and they can get all of this rich, valuable data about their ancestors quite accurately.
Absolutely, and
really cool.
There's the personal aspect. There's also historians who are terribly, because the web does decay. It's not there forever. Sites stop being maintained, and when they stop being maintained, they drop out, become 404 errors. And it may be very important. And war crime evidence, for example, the example I gave earlier, is often destroyed just because it's just awful. The companies get rid of it, they don't want to handle it. So there's all sorts of reasons to keep that stuff. What we don't know is, well, we can't keep it all. The question is, well, what do you keep and what do you not keep? What's important, what's not important? That's actually a really tough question. And as a society, we haven't given it very much thought. It may come out through common law cases. That may be how it does. Someone may define ways of doing it, I don't know. But it will become increasingly an issue as people want access to the stuff. Yorick Wilkes, the man I dedicated the talk to, I showed the photograph of him in the previous slide. He had, one of his things was he was inspired by the out of office email, and he thought, gosh, if I died, it would just say, I'm out of office forever. It would just say that. He thought it was very amusing. From that, he built this whole idea that we could actually build companions that are, and now with deepfake architecture, you can do it. So I went to a memorial service for Yorick at the Reform Club a couple of months ago. And at the end, they actually had a video of Yorick and someone doing an impression of his voice, and he was giving a little speech. And it was sort of that half creepy and half touching, right? But it was all deep fake. And he would have appreciated it, he would have liked the joke. So that sort of thing, talking to your ancestors might well be the sort of thing people want to do. But on the other hand, here's another question, who runs that? So let's say Facebook runs that service, provides that service. So your Uncle Walter can be, you can talk to your Uncle Walter, an avatar. And Uncle Walter may suddenly, who's he working for? Is he working for you? Is he Uncle Walter, or is he working for Zuckerberg? And he might start saying things like, well, what you ought to do is invest in a robot. You can have a robot that looks just like me and it's got exactly the same cognition, and then you can talk to me, and and then you can get that kind of interaction going. And Walter's actually just a corporate tool of the 21st century and not being his own genuine self. It's a tough one.
All right, thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it, especially the comparison between Plato's cave and Zuckerberg's cave. I really enjoyed that. But my question is about a question you asked at some point during your talk, which I would just like you to maybe enlighten me, especially a little bit. You said, can social media use or problematic social media use affect memory? So the question is, what would you describe as problematic, and what kind of memory are you referring to?
Yeah, fair question. So I'm not an expert on this, right? I should say. I think, I mean, I go back to the last slide about memory being something that's evolved to serve us, right? It didn't evolve as a truth machine. It evolved as something that would enable us to negotiate our environment. And memory is working very well if that's what it does, right? And everything should be sort of subordinate to that. So there are certainly cases where people's social media use is just problematic. They are addictive. They are addicted, and of course the architecture is built to be addictive. So and some people are just sort of on it all the time. There's to the detriment of their social lives. That's a problem. On the other hand, most people are not like that. So I tend to take quite a laissez-faire view of this, in that no one's forced to join a social network, right? It's always voluntary. There may be countries in the world where it's not voluntary, but at least in the West, it's pretty voluntary. And it may be that you need to be on LinkedIn to get a career, but no one's forcing you to have a career. It's a kind of a where does it become something that's coerced on you, rather than something that's a stepping stone to something you want to achieve? And that's a hard question to answer in the round. For individuals, it will depend. But there's all sorts of experiments about what happens. Can you put your smartphone away for a month? And some people have terrible withdrawal symptoms. Some people think it's wonderful. So I think it's very difficult to generalize. But these are the questions we need to ask, and we need to ask those questions of ourselves. Are these things, are all these connections? So I don't have a smartphone. I have this little trap phone, drug dealer's trap phone. You can edit that out, can't you? Partly the reason is I don't really want to get trapped in that kind of world. I don't want, and there's a cost, because I'd never know where I am. I never know what my wife is up to. She's in there in the front row. I can see her now, but when she's out of sight, she's got a smartphone. Which is connected to a neuron in my brain, and just the one. And so it's a problem we have to solve for ourselves. But I think being aware that there's a problem is a good start. But a really nice question.
My question was, where do you see the future of memory? If we've developed memory as a way of like mind sharing and community and learning and passing information down through generations and archive and stuff. But we've gotten to the point in technology where the technology and the data is overtaking the purpose that memory served in the first place. And then we've gotten to the stage where we can now see in technology, like with your Doctor Who reference, that our memory is not a true necessary representation of things that have happened. And so taking the stand, and that's kind of, like in a legal sense, if a video is a much more true representation of something that's happened, where do you, like, will it slowly dissolve from the brain?
Well, until the deepfake arrives, and then the video isn't. It's a fair question. I mean, I think we will always have our moments, our introspective moments, our moments on our own. We'll always have our individual parts. I think one of the reasons this particular technological revolution has been so influential and so powerful is that the small group has always been neglected in memory support over the years. Memory supports have always been either for the individual or for the community, not like a social group, like a family or a group like this. We might have a little social memory between us that only lasts a few days while we discuss these sort of issues. So that's why it's powerful. I don't see any reason why memory should fade away. There will always be, people will certainly start to think, well, why would I bother remembering, my times tables, let's say, or when I was a kid, it used to be logarithms. We used to learn logarithms, and we would have a calculator. Why would I learn logarithms? It was impossible. And the same will become true of various things nowadays. So there's always going to be a role it's going to play, because memory is, when we do make choices, we need to have some kind of self-reference as well as reference. We can't simply take all recommendations as gospel. At some point, if I get lots of rubbish recommendations from Amazon or TikTok or something, I'm going to remember that and stop. Small example. But over a sort of larger lifetime, the political choices you make, the choices you make about what kind of life you want your career and so on, they are often driven by external circumstances, but at various times you yourself can kind of enter the decision-making process and say, actually, I didn't enjoy that. I'm not going to do this anymore. So there'll always be a role, I think.
Hiya, thank you for your talk. I'm wondering if you could say a couple words on how to understand reflexive modernity, or how you understand that.
So, I now have to dredge this up from my memory because I didn't bone up on it. So reflexive memory, reflexive modernity. So this was, basically the sort of view of modernity that grew up as the industrial era declined, and as the big ideological chasm between left and right collapsed. And it was collapsing before the Berlin Wall fell down, actually. But so there's a period of about 1980 to about 2000 when people started to dismantle hierarchies, get less interested in hierarchical command and control, and more interested in horizontal networks as means of organising their lives, means of organising their work. So, we got in the business world, giant corporations split off and became lots of little companies that specialised in particular things, because that was the way to do things, not be the giant consortium. Middle management layers disappeared, and you got agile management, and the people on the shop floor would talk directly to the people at the top, and the people at the shop floor knew more about what was going wrong on the shop floor than their managers did. So why do we have their managers? This kind of companies like Toyota pioneered that. So reflexivity comes into it because this is something that Giddens and Ulrich Beck paid a lot of attention to. It was the fact that whereas in the old command and control days, decisions, economic or political decisions, were made and we went along with them. Now we were involved in the decision making, and it had become far more democratic. Our own reactions became involved, right? So, an example is opinion polling. Let's say it's a trivial example, but suppose I'm asked on Tuesday who I'm going to vote for on Wednesday, right? And I don't like the government, so I say, well, I'll vote Tory or I'll vote Reform because I don't like the government. And then on Wednesday, I see the opinion polls published, and it says Reform might win. And then suddenly I think, my God, Reform might win. I don't want Reform to win. And so my vote might switch back to Labour. So and I used to tell that anecdote with the Tories and Labour switched. That's not just a political point, that's just a function of whoever's in government. So when I'm asked the question on Tuesday, who am I going to vote for on Thursday? Actually, I'm not making a prediction because I will enter the data. And so reflexively, I have to understand not only my opinion of the world on Tuesday, but also what my opinion of the world on Wednesday is going to look like when my particular opinion is filtered through. And there's a lot of kind of decisions like that where it's not a straightforward linear set of processes. It's you react to all sorts of changes. And this is what Giddens and Beck and Zygmunt Bauman, all drew attention to, the fact that you can no longer control the world because we're all going off in different directions and we're all changing our minds and doing different things at different times. So the command and control world was dead. So that's what reflexive modernity was all about. I hope to God there isn't a sociologist in this room who would give me 2 out of 10 for my answer there. But
Hi, Kieron. I must say I enjoyed the subjective nature of your lecture. I wanted to ask primarily about memory. In terms of, you said that as humans we're imperfect, so our memory is therefore imperfect, and you said that technology and phones are a more perfect version of reality. But I want to ask if that is necessarily better, if we have memories that might hark back to a painful time, or whether that's to do with family or friends or just oneself. Could it be argued that it's better to remember something simply from your memory, even though in effect it's probably deceiving you in a sense, than to be deceived by a video or a picture on your phone that you took that that you were also in a way deceiving yourself? You might have altered something about you, as you said, or changed the angle, or changed even something as simple as a bed sheet, or the direction where a pillow is, or in that picture or that video, it's still not perfect. It's malleable, and I want to ask, in a sense, is it in what way is it better to be deceived? Is it better to be deceived by our own memory, or some kind of technology?
A nice question. I agree with you. So first of all, let me just put the ideas about digital modernity in context. What it is a kind of narrative, or even a kind of myth about what life is like now. And we can take it, I think, in the 3 kind of ways, these kind of myths of modernity or digital modernity or whatever. One is descriptive, right? This is where we are, this is what's happening. One, and this is kind of the way I meant it, is sort of more teleological, right? This is the direction of travel. We're headed to something that's doing this kind of thing. The third is normative. You would say, it ought to be like this. And one of the reasons I think that the digital modernity myth is so powerful is that an awful lot of powerful people buy into it at the normative level, right? Mark Zuckerberg, Sam Altman, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, people like this are powerful enough and rich enough to make these things happen, and clever enough. Let's give them credit for their immense genius. They are clever enough to make these things happen. Is it a better way of doing things? It's a different way. It's better in some ways, not in others. I do worry about the fact that reality is lagging. Is always 2 paces behind the algorithm, and things do get changed. On the other hand, maybe they change for the better. Maybe we should all do 10,000 steps a day, right? The question is, I think the question comes down to, and this I think it speaks to your question as well, is what good are we trying to produce when we use this technology, and who's good, and who defines that good, right? Is it a medical person who tells me what my body should be doing, or should I make the decision, or should it be a collective decision by a social group? If I go out, every time I have a pint, my life expectancy falls by a sort of tiny amount, and at some point the data will tell me to stop doing this, and then at some point I will have to either decide to go against the data and get another round in, or alternatively believe the data and leave the pub, right? And that's a tricky question. In medical matters, most people would say the reality was the idea of what is medically good is reasonably well established, although sociologists like Foucault would say no, that's constructed. There are other matters, what should I wear? What words should I use? Which people should I care for? What are my responsibilities? A lot of these will. So for example, there's a lot of effort spent working out how many carbon emissions we should be pumping out per person, right? And that's a classic example of digital modernity, right? Because Greta Thunberg is not terrified by the climate, right? Climate's fine, no problem. We can walk outside there, it's absolutely perfectly right. Greta Thunberg is terrified by a computational model that says in the year 2070 or 2100, the world will have all these terrible things going on. But that's a computational model, right? So that is an example of the data outrunning reality. And then the question is Greta right to say that we should be listening to the model, not our instincts, that, or someone like Trump would say, we should be listening to our instincts and not the model. It's just a model. It's just scientists who want to bilk us and control everything we do. Really hard questions. When we're answering at this level, you don't need to persuade me about climate change, but how do I persuade a climate skeptic to get through that barrier? It's really hard because it's exactly the barrier you referred to in your question.
Thank you very much.
Hi, all very interesting, and it kind of brought a memory of me reading a book by Nicholas Carr, The Shallows. I don't know if you're familiar. Kind of started me thinking, what do you think about the critical thinking and how, because obviously our memories affect critical thinking. And I kind of feel that it's in decline these days, where people offload their memories to cloud and ask all sorts of questions on Google. I work with SEO, so I can see in programs what questions are asked. And sometimes they are so ridiculous and so plain that, some of them could be answered simply by living your life. So I'm wondering what do you think about where the critical thinking is going? Because I think it's and how the fact that we use technology for memory, for offloading memory to technology.
Yeah, these are good questions. So you refer, I'll just referred to the book by Nicholas Carr called The Shallows, he basically argued that we were outsourcing too much of our thinking to Google and to the ambient data infrastructure, as I would more pompously say, and as a result we're losing mental cognitive capacity. Sherry Turkle makes a similar kind of argument about younger people. There's clearly a lot happening, and the question is, so I don't actually doubt Carr's and Turkle's account. The question is whether it's the whole story, and are we gaining on the swings what we're losing on the roundabouts, if that's not a mixed metaphor. So there's clearly a lot of critical thinking going on in the world because, there's a lot of skepticism. what that skepticism is, it seems to me. I mean, I will say I am a rationalist and a believer in reason and scientific method and doing things properly and not being rude to traffic wardens. I believe all of those things. But there are clearly lots of people who have felt very oppressed by intellectual elites. I mean, I'm not calling myself an elite, but intellectual elites have clearly been very oppressive. We get something like vaccine skepticism. A friend of mine, sociologist, did a lot of work with vaccine skeptics round about actually the turn of the century. And she found that they took this scientific maxim to keep an open mind very literally, and they kept an open mind even when science was telling them not to keep an open mind. And it's like, well, how do you argue against that position? It's actually an intellectually very respectable position. And the result is that they decided that vaccination is bad for them, and they refused it. And then this, of course, when we had the pandemic, this became a global and deeply political problem that everyone had ignored for many years. So I think there's a lot of critical thinking about. What I think it is undirected by the traditional top-down hierarchical elitist academic order that prevailed in the 20th century. So in the 1980s, Mary Warnock, who's a very famous philosopher, did a report into God, the word has now escaped me. What was the Warnock report? Yeah, thank you, reproductive technology. I could only think of the word making babies, and I thought this was... Who would do a report into that? Artificial reproduction and all this. What should we do? Should we allow experiments and embryos? And she did a report, and it was philosophically very well informed. It was very well argued. It argued for a sort of measure of liberalism tempered by caution and all the sensible things you would expect from a Cambridge philosopher. And it was very well received, and it got written into law, and everyone was very respectful of it. And the idea that that might happen now, I think, is a joke. I mean, if Edward was asked to do a report, Oxford philosopher, do a report on something deeply controversial, socially important, the Trumps of this world would simply not accept anything he said. I couldn't possibly comment on whether that be the right decision. I'm sure it would be the wrong decision. But the idea that nowadays a philosopher could decide the issues around something as controversial as artificial insemination is not happening at all. So a class of people that has been used to internal criticism but not external criticism and I'm in that class, so I'm not being smug. Is now subject no longer just to internal criticism but to external criticism. So I think the critical thing is still there. It's now the bull has escaped the field and is down in the china shop. If you don't mind the metaphor going a bit berserk, but
well, that takes us to time. So. It's a little bit of scepticism about top-down theorising. Does us no harm at 8:15 in the evening. Thank you so much for your participation, and thank you, Kieron, for a fascinating talk.
Thank you very much.